The pros and cons of living on the East Coast. Hi there, everyone. It's Jeff, and this is Plain English, lesson number 688. It's Monday, July 1st, 2024. Happy Independence Day if you are in Canada. Here at Plain English, we help you upgrade your English. This summer, we're doing some episodes about life in the U.S., and this week, we'll be talking about life on the two coasts of the United States. Today, we'll talk about the East Coast. On Thursday, we'll talk about the West Coast. And by the end of the week, you'll know whether you're more of an East Coast person or more of a West Coast person. In the second half of today's lesson, I'll show you what it means to focus on something. Remember, this is lesson number 688, so you can find the full lesson resources, the transcript, the quiz, the exercises, the practice area, all that at plainenglish.com/688. Before we dive into today's story, you've heard me mention some of the great ways our Plus membership can help you upgrade your English, and you might be curious about what that looks like. We've recently unlocked some free samples so that you can try out the premium features for yourself. Even if you don't join, you'll still learn something from the sample lessons. Sound good? Look for the link that says free samples at the top of plainenglish.com. I've also put a direct link to the samples at the bottom of the show notes of this episode. Now, we're ready to start today's story. The East Coast of the United States is about 3,300 kilometers long. It extends from the remote forests of Maine to the sandy beaches of Florida. But when you say East Coast, people often understand the Northeast, the region between Washington, D.C. and Boston. So that's the area we'll focus on today. About 50 million people live in this corridor, and it has its own culture and lifestyle. So let's take a look at East Coast living. Start with the weather. On the East Coast, you experience 4 distinct seasons: winter, spring, summer, and fall. Winters are cold and snowy. Summers are hot and humid. Spring and fall tend to be more moderate temperature-wise. A lot of people, myself included, like the annual rhythm of the changing seasons. The changing seasons also let you experience, close to home, different types of outdoor activities. But the weather is not often cited as a pro of East Coast living. Winters can be cold and dark. People suffer from seasonal affective disorder in the winter. There are more car accidents because of winter storms. Utility bills are high. You pay for air conditioning in the summer and heat in the winter. The East Coast has a rich history. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. have played important roles in the nation's civic and economic development. You can see Thomas Edison's laboratory in New Jersey, the country's first lending library in Massachusetts, and Ellis Island in New York Harbor. That's where millions of immigrants first set foot on dry land in North America. You can visit Revolutionary War sites, important meeting halls, churches, Civil War battlegrounds, monuments, museums, and more, all within a few hours' drive of each other. This is one of the great advantages of living on the East Coast. You can always find something historic, educational, or cultural to do. There's diversity in outdoor activities too. Most places are just a couple of hours from a beach. Cape Cod, the Jersey Shore, and Delaware's Rehoboth Beach are some of the best ones. There are great mountains, lakes, streams, and valleys to explore too. Skiing is an option in the winter. If you live near New York or Boston, you can get to ski slopes in Vermont and New Hampshire in a few hours. The great cities on the East Coast developed before the age of the car, so it's no surprise that the best public transit in the United States is on the East Coast. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington all have subway systems and commuter trains. America's only high-speed rail line connects Washington to Boston in about 7 hours. The East Coast also has some of the country's best museums and cultural institutions. If you want to see an opera, browse paintings and sculptures, or hear a symphony orchestra, the East Coast has a museum or concert hall for you. The East Coast has many of the country's highest-ranking universities and hospitals. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, the University of Pennsylvania, Johns Hopkins University, Georgetown University, all East Coast institutions. You'll find a rich diversity of people on the East Coast, in part because the universities are magnets for immigrants from around the world. There's a tremendous amount of ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity in the major cities. If you work in traditional finance, government, or media, the East Coast is probably your home. New York is the king of fashion and advertising, not to mention finance. Boston is known for its healthcare, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Washington, of course, for law and government. Lifestyle-wise, people often say the pace of life is faster in the Northeast. There's pushing and shoving on the sidewalk, late nights at the office, and a hustle culture to get ahead. People dress more formally, both at work and out of the office, than they do elsewhere. Salaries are relatively high on the East Coast, but so are costs. The East Coast has a greater orientation toward Europe. The workday overlaps by 3 or 4 hours with the workday in London and Paris. A flight from New York to London, Boston to Dublin, or DC to Brussels is an easy overnight direct flight. Finally, the time zone. Any national event that has a single starting time will be optimized for the East Coast viewer. Major sporting events are most convenient in the East. Football games on Sundays start at 1 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 8 o'clock. They start at 10 in the morning out west. Even the Oscars are optimized for the East Coast. They start at 7 o'clock in New York and 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Los Angeles. The stock market opens at a leisurely 9:30 in New York, but a punishing 6:30 a.m. on the West Coast. I grew up on the East Coast. I was born in New Jersey, grew up in Connecticut, went to college near Philadelphia. So, in many ways, this is my home region. I'll tell you what I like. I do like the 4 seasons. I like the geographic diversity. There are great parks, rolling hills, forests, ski slopes, the coast, and all of that is within a few hours of the major cities. And the history is great too. So that's what I like about the East Coast, but that's not the only coast we have. On Thursday, we'll take a look at the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington State. And so by the end of this week, you'll know if you're more an East Coast kind of person or a West Coast kind of person. To focus on something is to give special attention to one thing. When you focus on something, you narrow your effort. You give special attention to a specific subject or area. You might start a meeting and say, in this meeting, we'll focus on the results of our last customer satisfaction survey. You might be with a wide variety of people. You might have a lot of things you could talk about with them. But if you say, we'll focus on the results of the customer survey, you mean to say that you will be giving special attention to that topic, the survey, and you won't use the meeting to talk about other things. So when you use focus on, you're talking about what will get your attention, but you're also excluding the things that will not get your attention. If you have kids and they keep calling you during the workday, you can tell them, I love you, but I need to focus on work for the next few hours. That means you need to give your attention to work, and it implies that you can't give your attention to personal matters just then. But the tables might turn later in the day. If you're having dinner with your family and someone from work texts you, you might respond, I can't focus on work right now. I'm with my family. So imagine you buy a beautiful old house, but it needs a lot of renovations inside. Your budget, not to mention your time, they're not unlimited. You can't do everything at once. So you might suggest to your spouse, let's focus on the kitchen for now. That means you're going to give your time, money, and attention to the kitchen. You're not going to worry about the bathrooms and the bedrooms right away. So you can see how focus on means giving specific attention to one thing, one subject, and not giving your attention to all of the other things that are competing for your attention. Sometimes you can use focus on to set a limit on a statement to make sure your listener understands the scope of what you're talking about. The East Coast of the United States is really long. 14 states have shoreline on the Atlantic Ocean. Another 3 states are pretty close. But when people say the East Coast, they often mean the Northeast, between Washington and Boston. Not always, but often. So when I told you about the culture on the East Coast, I said up front, I'm going to focus on the area between Washington and Boston. So I could have talked about North Carolina. I could have talked about Florida. I could have talked about Maine. All those states have shoreline on the Atlantic Ocean. But I said, I'm going to focus on the area between Washington and Boston. That set a limit on what I was going to talk about. There's a new documentary called Einstein and the Bomb. If you liked the movie Oppenheimer, you might want to put this documentary on your list. The documentary focuses on Einstein's connection to the development of nuclear weapons. This limits the scope of the topic. It's not a documentary about Einstein's full life. It's not even about Einstein's full body of work. It's not about the development of nuclear weapons. It's about something narrower than that. The documentary focuses on Einstein's connection to the development of nuclear weapons. So in this case, focuses on narrows the scope. It says what it includes, what it talks about, what it gives attention to, and focuses on tells you that it only talks about those things, not about other things. All right, that's all for this first summer edition of Plain English Summer 2024. On Thursday, we'll talk about West Coast living. And later on this summer, we'll talk about the Midwest, the South, and some other regions. Remember, this was lesson number 688, so the full lesson is at plainenglish.com/688, all thanks to JR. See you back here on Thursday. You've reached the end of the audio lesson, but there's a lot more to the Plain English experience on the website plainenglish.com. A lot of plainenglish.com is free, but the best tools to help you upgrade your English are part of the Starter and Plus memberships. And if you've ever been curious about what those look like, well, I have good news for you. We've unlocked some free sample lessons that let you try out the Starter and Plus features for yourself. There are 2 easy ways to find the free samples. First, at plainenglish.com, there's a new link at the top of the page that says Free Samples. I've also put a link in the show notes for this episode. In the sample lessons, you can do the exercises, listen to the fast audio, take one of our toolkit workshops, practice your writing, and more. So try it out today. Click the link in the show notes of this episode, or find the link that says free samples at the top of plainenglish.com.